The locals say the Ashworth house is older than the mountains that cradle eastern Kentucky, though no one remembers when it first appeared at the edge of the coal seams. It sits half swallowed by forest, its windows clouded like blind eyes that still manage to watch anyone foolish enough to wander too close. Most people keep their distance now. Those who don't, if well, the valleys have long memories, and missing person posters fade fast on rural roads. The leather-bound ledger was never meant to be found. It lay hidden behind a wall of rotting timber and coal dust inside the Ashworth family's abandoned coal house, tucked into a cavity so narrow and dark that anyone searching for it would have needed either remarkable persistence or the kind of blind, desperate luck that follows people who are already in too deep. The coal house itself had been collapsing for decades, its slanted roof groaning under the weight of vines and rain-softened shingles. Locals said the building used to store tools and carts when the mine still ran, but the Ashworths had repurposed it in their final years. What for, no one could say without lowering their voice. The floorboards were warped from moisture, buckling upward like ribs trying to break through skin. It was here, between those skeletal beams, that the ledger waited with the patience of something buried, something preserved, something that had a purpose far beyond whatever the Ashworths had intended. It was found by accident, or so the story goes, though around these hills accidents tend to happen only when something wants to be found. The man who discovered it was an amateur historian, someone who collected local ghost stories the way other people collected antique guns or old tin signs. He had been poking around the property at dusk, ignoring the usual warnings, stepping carefully over patches of ground that seemed too soft, too disturbed, too hungry. The coal house drew him with its half-open door and the faint glint of metal inside. When he pulled at a rusted shovel protruding from a pile of debris, part of the wall gave way, revealing the ledger resting atop a bed of blackened burlap. It was the only object not covered in dust, as if it had been placed there recently even though the Ashworth house had been empty for decades. The book was surprisingly intact. Its cover was made of dark, cracked leather that looked old despite the moisture in the air, and a metal clasp kept it shut as though its contents needed to be restrained. The historian carried it outside, wiping soot from his hands, and sat on a fallen beam while the sky dimmed behind the ridgeline. When he loosened the clasp and opened the first page, he felt a cold draft swirl around him, though the evening was warm and still. The names were written in ink that had not faded, clean and sharp as if written yesterday. Some had dates next to them, others had only the names alone, spaced evenly like entries in a ledger kept for business. The names were familiar to anyone who lived around these parts. Some belonged to drifters who had passed through town long ago. Others were the names of people parents still told their children about, warnings disguised as bedtime stories. But many of the names belonged to those who had vanished within living memory, people whose faces had stared from posters stapled to telephone poles, people whose search parties had trudged through the ravines and mine shafts until hope fell away and the only thing left to find was silence. The dates written beside those names matched the exact days the victims had disappeared, down to the month and year. At first, the historian believed the ledger was some twisted record kept by a paranoid family, a list of people who had wronged them or trespassed on their land. But the neatness of the handwriting, the consistency of the dates, and the sheer number of entries made the truth impossible to ignore. This was no journal. It was a catalogue. A logbook. A methodical accounting of bodies. Some of the names were marked with small symbols, circles, crosses, triangles, each one placed with careful intention. He later realized those symbols aligned with rumors about where remains had been found, or which parts of a body had gone missing, or what condition the corpse had been in when the authorities finally uncovered it. The Ashworths hadn't been documenting accidents or intruders. They had been tracking inventory. The strangest part was that the ledger didn't appear to be as old as it should have been. Its pages were crisp and free of mold. The ink didn't smudge when rubbed. Even the smell of the book was wrong. Instead of mildew and rot, it carried a faint scent of iron and something bitterly sweet, like overripe fruit left on a windowsill in summer heat. When the historian flipped to the back pages, he found entries with no dates at all, just more names. Names of people who, as far as he knew, hadn't gone missing. Names of people still very much alive. And at the very end, scrawled in handwriting that looked rushed and crooked, was his own name. His breath caught in his throat as he stared down at the ink, still glistening faintly as if not yet dry. He told himself it was impossible. He told himself someone was playing a prank. But as he sat there, clutching the ledger with trembling fingers, he heard something shift in the coal house behind him. A dragging sound. A low thump. Then another. As though something inside the building had just woken up, stretching its stiff limbs after years of being still. He tried to convince himself it was an animal, a raccoon or a stray dog, but the rhythm of the steps was too heavy, too deliberate. The sound grew closer, boards creaking in protest, dust sifting down like falling ash. And though he did not believe in the stories the way locals did, he felt the sudden and overwhelming certainty that the ledger had not been hidden away to protect it from time, but to protect the world from whatever truth it carried, a truth that had been waiting patiently for the next name on its list to turn the page. The ravine behind the Ashworth estate had always been a place people walked around, never through. It carved a long, jagged scar through the earth, its walls slick with moss and streaked with coal dust that glittered faintly when the moonlight angled the right way. Locals called it Deadman Split, though no one could recall where the name came from. When asked, they shrugged and said the land itself earned it. The air there felt colder, heavier, as if every breath had to fight its way past the memories buried beneath the roots and stone. Even before the voices began, people avoided it the way animals avoid places that remember blood. But once the voices started, soft at first, then unmistakable, Deadman Split became a wound that no one dared acknowledge out loud. The voices didn't come all the time. They rose only at dusk or just after rain, drifting through the trees like mist. At first, anyone who heard them swore it must be the wind curling strangely through the ravine's narrow throat. But wind never called people by name. Wind didn't sob. Wind didn't whisper in tones that sounded impossibly familiar, as if they came from someone you once knew, someone whose absence you still felt like a bruise. The first person to admit hearing the voices was a teenage boy who'd gone raccoon hunting with his father. He claimed he heard a woman calling for help from somewhere deep in the ravine. Her voice was shaky, panicked, repeating the same plea over and over. His father dismissed it as imagination fueled by moonlight and exhaustion. But when the boy described the voice in detail, the cadence, the accent, the way she said his name, his father went pale. Because he recognized the voice too. It belonged to the boy's aunt, who had gone missing 12 years earlier and whose body was never found. After that night, more stories surfaced in hesitant fragments. A farmer heard his brother's voice drifting from the ravine even though his brother had been dead for 2 summers. A hiker heard a child crying beneath the layers of trickling water, then calling out for their mother. A woman who walked her dog near the ridge swore she heard someone whisper her own name right behind her ear, so close she felt the breath brush her skin. But when she turned, the dog was cowering, tail tucked, staring at the ravine with its fur bristled as if it saw something she could not. Most of these stories were shared quietly, between neighbors, over fences or back porches, always with the same uneasy glance toward the woods as though the ravine itself might be listening. The voices grew clearer after the ledger was discovered. More precise. Some seemed to rise straight from the ground, vibrating through the soil as though something buried beneath the layers of rock and earth was pushing upward, straining to be heard. Once, a pair of hikers recorded the sounds on their phone, muffled but distinctly human. When they played it back later, the recording captured a trembling voice repeating a first name 3 times, followed by a brittle, broken laugh that didn't sound like it came from lungs so much as from an empty space echoing itself. The hikers left town the next morning, abandoning their reservation at a local lodge without explanation. No one could agree on what the voices wanted. Some believed the ravine was a graveyard the Ashworths had used when the family plots filled up or when they needed to dispose of evidence quickly. Others whispered about a cave system beneath the estate, a network of forgotten mineshafts and natural tunnels where the missing had been dragged to their fate. If the Ashworths were truly body merchants, as the stories claimed, then the ravine might have been where the rejected, the unsellable, or the unfinished ended up. But the most chilling theory was the one the older folks murmured during storms, that the voices were not merely echoes of the dead but warnings from those who were not fully gone, trapped somewhere between breathing and remembering, bound to the land by whatever curse or cruelty the Ashworths had inflicted. One man, a night shift guard at a nearby junkyard, claimed he followed the voices once. He said he heard what sounded like his younger sister calling for him. She had disappeared when he was 14, taken one afternoon while walking home from school. He had never forgiven himself for not seeing her sooner, for not walking her home when she begged him to. When he heard her voice drifting from the ravine, soft, trembling, calling him by the nickname only she used, he felt a pull he couldn't resist. He walked down the narrow path, stumbled over uneven stones, and slid halfway down the ravine's edge before something invisible seized him with a pressure so cold it felt like metal pressed to his spine. He froze. His sister's voice was inches away now, whispering his name with breath so moist and warm he swore something living stood behind him. But when he turned, there was only the black mouth of a cave, its entrance wide enough to swallow a grown man whole. He scrambled back up the slope, tearing his palms open on roots and rocks. For weeks afterward, he said he still heard his sister at night, whispering from the tree line, asking him why he left her again. Eventually, the voices began to repeat names written in the ledger. Not all at once, but enough to draw a pattern. The same names locals had seen on missing person bulletins. The same names that should not have been spoken aloud, not in that ravine, not by mouths that no longer existed. Some believed the voices were trying to reveal the truth, begging for release from whatever held them captive beneath the earth. Others believed something darker was mimicking the dead, luring the living closer. But everyone agreed on one thing: once the ravine knew your name, it never forgot it. The rumors about the Ashworths had always carried an undertone of commerce, the whispered suggestion that the family had never merely stolen from graves but had profited from the dead in ways that made the mind recoil. What no one could have anticipated, however, was the scale and deliberate precision of their operation, a network that stretched farther than the creeks and ridges of eastern Kentucky, reaching into towns where the faintest whisper of their name could still draw chills decades later. Investigators who dared poke into the Ashworth estate long after it had been abandoned uncovered signs that the family had functioned less like a household and more like a company, each member assigned tasks with meticulous, almost industrial efficiency. Some exhumed, some prepared, and some transported the bodies. But the true horror lay not in the taking of life alone, nor even in the exhumations, but in the delivery, selling flesh, bones, and organs to buyers whose motivations were darker, more arcane, and in some accounts, almost ritualistic in nature. The Ashworths were body merchants in the truest sense, facilitating a market so macabre that the town had learned to speak of it only in cautious, haunted fragments. Evidence emerged slowly. A minor-turned-amateur historian stumbled upon crates long hidden in a collapsed shed behind the estate, each labeled in fading ink with codes no one in the valley recognized. Inside were items catalogued with the same obsessive care the family had given to the ledger: partial skeletons wrapped in oilcloth, jars of preserved tissue, tools for dissection meticulously sharpened and sterilized, even small, sealed caskets with faded labels noting names and dates. The more he dug, the more he realized that these remnants were not meant for the ground, they were commodities. The Ashworths had known buyers existed, a clandestine clientele willing to pay for the forbidden, for bodies that had not yet cooled, for specimens that could serve purposes the living could scarcely imagine. When he cross-referenced the ledger with these items, the chilling logic became impossible to deny. Every disappearance, every unsolved case from surrounding counties, aligned with a transaction somewhere, a delivery somewhere, a buyer somewhere who had quietly obtained what the Ashworths offered in hushed secrecy. The transactions themselves were rumored to be ritualized. People who had trespassed or observed the family in their last years described strange ceremonies, candlelit rooms filled with smoke and the muted scent of embalming fluids, whispered invocations meant to prepare the human body for delivery. Some spoke of ancient Appalachian folklore invoked alongside medical terminology, a blending of superstition and science that suggested the Ashworths believed in more than just profit. They believed that the bodies themselves carried power, energy that could be harnessed for purposes beyond the natural, and that the way a body was prepared, preserved, and delivered could affect that energy. The rituals were private and terrifyingly meticulous, specific chants at precise intervals, bodies positioned in ways that mirrored old family portraits, and incantations whispered over each crate as it was sealed and labeled. Outsiders were never welcome, and anyone who tried to linger too long risked discovery, or worse, being added to the next shipment themselves. Some local legends claimed the buyers were not ordinary humans. They were described as men and women who appeared at the estate under cover of night, never interacting with the townsfolk, their identities hidden behind hoods or masks. They arrived in unmarked vehicles, sometimes leaving with cargoes too large for one person to carry alone. In hushed tones, witnesses would note that the visitors carried a kind of aura, a sense of danger and otherness that suggested the Ashworths were supplying more than bodies. They were supplying instruments, vessels, or perhaps ingredients for experiments that skirted the line between science and something far older, far darker. It was impossible to confirm these claims, yet no one doubted that the family had built a reputation that extended well beyond the valleys. Even the most rational townsfolk found themselves shivering at the thought of the estate's back door opening quietly in the dead of night, the echoes of whispered transactions lingering like a scent they could never scrub away. The scale of the operation also hinted at complicity within the family itself. The Ashworths were not a single hand acting in isolation. Records suggested specialization: one member oversaw exhumation, another preservation, another delivery. Each ledger entry and each crate matched their internal system, demonstrating an efficiency that went beyond mere criminal enterprise. The estate functioned like a hub, a central node in a network that extended into the region's shadows. While official records of missing persons piled up in dusty courthouse files, the Ashworths worked quietly, systematically, and without hesitation. Their business was methodical, almost industrial, yet tinged with a sinister reverence for what they handled. Their motivations were not solely monetary. The meticulous cataloging, the rituals, and the precise methods all hinted at a belief that their work had meaning, a significance beyond the mere act of taking or selling human life. For decades, investigators who pieced together fragments of this operation could only speculate about the buyer's intentions. Some suggested medical institutions or universities with shady practices, others claimed secret societies seeking immortality or occult knowledge. The Ashworths themselves left nothing to paper trails, no receipts, no letters, only the ledger, the crates, and the enduring pattern of disappearances. Over time, the network faded as the family died off or disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving the estate abandoned. Yet the lingering sense of purpose remained, as if the estate itself remembered the deals, the ceremonies, and the transactions, the very walls imbued with the energy of those who had been moved, preserved, and dispatched, their lives catalogued with the cold precision of commerce and the reverent terror of ritual. If you want, I can continue with key point number 4 expanded in the same style and length, so the story keeps building naturally from the suspense of the ledger and the ravine into the living consequences of the Ashworth's dark trade. Do you want me to do that next? The first time someone saw them, no one believed it. People returning from the ridges, from the dark hollows behind the Ashworth estate, swore they had glimpsed figures moving just beyond the tree line, motionless and silent, yet unmistakably human. At first, the sightings were dismissed as tricks of the light, shadows cast by the moon through the skeletal branches of the forest. But the descriptions grew too consistent to ignore. Travelers, hunters, and even the occasional curious hiker reported seeing faces that seemed frozen in time, familiar yet wrong, hollowed and distant, and each face carried an expression of fear or anguish that no actor could replicate. It was as if the missing had returned, but not entirely themselves. Something lingered beneath their skin, an emptiness in their eyes that spoke of things the living were not meant to understand. The townsfolk began whispering of the returned, a phrase spoken cautiously, like a prayer that naming them might draw their attention. Those who claimed to have seen the return said the figures moved strangely, shifting almost imperceptibly, as if carried by currents invisible to the human eye. They were often found near the estate, standing silently in the shadows, sometimes on the property line, staring toward the house. Some witnesses described the sensation of being watched through their very bones, as though the returned were not merely observing but feeling them, assessing them, cataloguing them as carefully as the Ashworths once catalogued the living and the dead. Children in particular were said to shrink back in fear, refusing to go outside after dusk, whispering that the returned were calling names, their voices carried faintly on the wind, a lamentation that twisted the heart. The connection to the ledger became apparent slowly. Names from the ledger, once mere entries, now seemed to manifest in these spectral returns. A man who had grown up near the Ashworth estate swore he saw his childhood friend standing at the edge of the woods one late evening, her eyes wide and unblinking, the same eyes that had vanished without a trace 20 years before. She did not speak, but her lips moved as though murmuring, repeating the whispered pleas recorded in the ledger decades ago. When he approached, she recoiled slightly, as if aware of her own state, aware that her presence was no longer fully her own. It became a pattern. The ledger's names were not merely records, they were keys, summoning those who had vanished back into the world, though not in the form they had left it. Some who encountered the return tried to speak to them. They called out names, reached forward, attempted to touch them. But contact was always denied. Hands passed through the figures as if through mist. Voices, if attempted, were muffled, swallowed by an oppressive silence that seemed to emanate from the land itself. The returned moved with an eerie deliberation, sometimes vanishing entirely when the observer tried to follow, leaving behind only the faintest impressions in soft earth or dew-soaked grass. More than one person claimed that they saw the figures emerge from the forest at night, only to vanish into thin air when morning came. These experiences left people unnerved, incapable of conveying the depth of the horror they had witnessed to anyone who had not seen it themselves. The phenomenon became a source of superstition and fear, giving rise to new local rituals and warnings. Parents would chant old protective prayers, hang charms on windows, and keep children indoors when the sun dipped below the mountains. Hunters carried silver or iron charms, nothing more than symbolic protection, though some swore it helped keep the figures at bay. The returned were not aggressive in the traditional sense, they did not attack, did not speak curses, did not lunge. Their danger lay in their presence, in the weight of what they embodied, the consequence of the Ashworth family's dealings, the physical manifestation of those lost to greed, cruelty, and secret commerce, and the incomprehensible transformation wrought upon their bodies and spirits. The returned also displayed strange behavior near the Ashworth house itself. Some were seen lingering at the thresholds, peering through clouded windows, their faces pressed against glass that had not been cleaned in decades. Others were reported to walk slowly around the perimeter, pausing at the corners, tracing invisible lines across the property as if measuring it, marking it in ways only they could understand. There were accounts of individuals attempting to leave the valley, only to encounter the returned along the path, always appearing at the edges of vision, forcing them to retreat. Travelers who ignored the sign said they felt compelled to turn back, an invisible pressure driving them toward safety, toward distance. In each case, the implication was clear: the Ashworth estate and its surroundings were no longer merely property, no longer just land, it had become a domain, the territory of the returned, a place where the boundaries of life and death blurred, where the missing could walk once more, but never as they had been. Scholars and investigators who attempted to study the returned scientifically or rationally found themselves unable to reconcile the phenomena with any conventional explanation. Cameras often failed, recordings would capture only shadows or distorted blurs, and attempts to interact with them physically produced nothing but a creeping sense of dread that could linger for days. Psychological assessments were inconclusive, witnesses did not suffer hallucinations or delusions, and many were highly credible members of the community. The returned had substance, presence, and consistency, yet remained untouchable and incomprehensible, a cruel liminality between existence and absence that could not be measured, quantified, or explained. As the sightings increased, it became clear that the Ashworth legacy had not ended with the disappearance of the family. Their work, their cataloguing of human life and death, had created a tether that bound these lost souls to the land, an unseen force resurrecting them in partial, hollowed forms to roam the property and its periphery. The returned were proof that the ledger and the ravine, the rituals, and the deliveries, had consequences far beyond what anyone could have imagined, consequences that persisted long after the human agents were gone, consequences that could not be buried, burned, or ignored. The valley itself seemed to pulse with recognition whenever they appeared, the trees bending slightly as if acknowledging the presence of those who had been taken and returned in incomplete, unsettling echoes of their former selves, reminding all who watched that the Ashworth family's influence was neither past nor forgotten, but alive in the figures that haunted the night. The Ashworth estate had always been a house apart, older than memory, stubbornly resisting decay, perched on its ridge like a sentinel. But after the ledger was found, after the voices in the ravine had begun to speak names aloud, after the returned had started walking the land, the estate itself seemed to awaken. Visitors, and even those who lived in the shadow of the mountains, began reporting subtle but undeniable changes, doors that moved slightly on their own, swinging shut or opening just enough to suggest someone, or something, had passed through. Windows that had long been clouded with dust and mildew would fog as if breathing, only to clear moments later in patterns that mimicked human faces. Floors would shift beneath a person's feet, a low groan following each step, as though the house were aware of the weight of those moving through it, calculating and responding. The first accounts were dismissed by the rational, chalked up to old timber settling or creaking floors from changing temperatures. But when a pair of local investigators stayed overnight in the main hall, the activity escalated beyond explanation. They reported hearing footsteps pacing along the upper corridors, even though no stairs existed to reach certain rooms from the level they occupied. Doors slammed without wind, and the subtle vibrations underfoot were synchronized with the distant echoes of voices they recognized from the ravine. One investigator swore he saw the house itself twitch, the corner of the east wing flexing outward slightly, as if a ribcage had inhaled and exhaled. By dawn, both men were pale, exhausted, and unwilling to return, speaking only of the sense that the house was alive in a way that defied logic. The returned were drawn to the estate with an almost magnetic inevitability. They lingered near the thresholds, their hollow eyes fixed on the warped doors and windows. At times, they appeared to vanish into walls, only to re-emerge in different rooms, as though the house allowed them passage in ways the living could not comprehend. Witnesses described the sensation of a presence pressing against the house, moving like a living thing, subtle at first, then undeniable. Small objects shifted without cause, books slid off shelves, chairs tipped over, and in one account, a mirror seemed to bend inward before shattering on its own. The estate absorbed the activity of the returned and responded, a symbiotic pattern emerging between the spectral figures and the structure itself. The house was no longer a static relic but a participant, perhaps even the orchestrator, in the macabre ecosystem created by the Ashworth's history. Local legends, whispered in hushed tones over cracked porches and around wood stoves, began describing the estate as a sentient guardian of the ledger, of the rituals, and of the bodies once delivered. One elder woman recounted that her great-uncle had been a miner in the Ashworth Valley and had spoken of the estate's unusual behavior even when the family still lived there. He described hallways that seemed to shift overnight, staircases that would appear in rooms where they had not existed, and whispers that followed one from room to room, naming not just people, but places and events. She had dismissed the stories as exaggerations of old age until the night the returned appeared on the ridge and the house, she swore, reached outward, bending the shadows in unnatural angles as if embracing the lost souls it had once sheltered. The estate's awakening manifested in more tangible ways, too. Electrical devices, rare in that region, but sometimes present for occasional investigators or urban explorers, would fail, lights flickering in time with a low rumble that seemed to emanate from deep within the foundation. Cold drafts would snake through halls, forming shapes in the air like the contours of limbs or faces. In one instance, a person attempting to hide in a back bedroom found the floor beneath them sinking slightly, a depression forming as though the house itself were swallowing them, then returning to its original shape when they moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but terrifying in its implication, the Ashworth estate remembered. It remembered every name, every delivery, every ritual, every whispered plea, and it responded accordingly, shifting to accommodate, to manipulate, and perhaps to punish. Investigators also noted that the estate's activity seemed to respond to intent. Those who approached with curiosity or a desire to expose its secrets experienced a crescendo of activity, doors swinging violently, windows rattling, floors groaning under unseen weight, while those who entered quietly, almost reverently, reported subtler manifestations, objects shifted just enough to guide, shadows moved in a way that suggested a path through the estate, and faint echoes of the returned whispered names as warnings. It was as if the house distinguished between those seeking truth and those seeking intrusion, rewarding or punishing each according to some internal logic. The returned themselves were drawn deeper into the estate over time, often disappearing from the surrounding forest entirely, only to reappear in the halls, crouched on staircases, leaning against walls, or staring from broken windows. Their presence animated the house further, causing structural elements to shift and distort. Ceilings would sag just enough to block passage temporarily, walls seemed to lean inward, and floors creaked in unnatural patterns. The combination of the estate and the returned created a feedback loop, an ever-escalating cycle of awareness and movement that no human could navigate safely. Some of the most unnerving accounts came from those who tried to record evidence. Cameras malfunctioned inexplicably, footage distorted, audio captured only static and whispers, and batteries drained with alarming speed. Lights in the house would dim and brighten unpredictably, shadows stretching across walls in impossible angles. It became clear to anyone who spent time there that the Ashworth estate was not merely a haunted building, it was a vessel, a collector, a sentinel, and perhaps even a predator, consuming the energy of those who had been delivered into its care and those foolish enough to trespass on the land it claimed as its own. The awakening was gradual yet undeniable, an escalation that began as small disturbances and evolved into a living, breathing intelligence, capable of manipulating the physical world and bending the very rules of human perception. It fed on the legacy of the Ashworths, the Ledger, the Ravine, and the Returned, consolidating their influence into something beyond comprehension, beyond mortality, beyond escape, until the estate itself was more than a house, it was a force, a presence, a guardian of macabre history that no one could confront or outrun.